Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our community development meeting. Today's date is July 10, 2025. The time is 10:05 a.m. In attendance are Commissioners Eberline, Duncan, and Matari. I'm going to call this meeting to order. There's no opening remarks. Are there any changes to the agenda? Hearing none. Poll for conflicts. Any conflicts? Any conflicts? No conflicts. We'll go right into our public hearing. This is actually a continuation, ZON 24-007 Elder Road East continuation and ZON 24-008 Elder Road West continuation. It's an action item. I have Vlad Finkel here, but Director Callahan, do you want to start us off?
Yes, sir. I'd like to, thank you, Pat. I'd like to give a broad overview, then I'll turn things over to Ben and Vlad for details. But first off, my apologies. We erred. As of last night, you had the same file twice in your electronic file. I'm sorry. We corrected that this morning about 30 minutes ago. That was just an error on our part. But it also speaks to the broader issue of normally we like to have these things at least a week ahead of time before your hearing. And we got the last version of this Monday, so we were scrambling a bit. So again, my apologies. Going down to the actual cases, I think what's improved, at least in my view, is now we have a more refined set of use on each side, west and east. But there are still some open-ended questions like on the west side, where we now have in the CZDA a request to list the commercial resort as the use allowed in now the commercial district. That's unusual and actually I think unique, because commercial resort is normally reserved for agricultural, rural, agricultural, suburban, and restricted residential zoning districts, because it's normally handled as a conditional use permit process. That creates a little bit of weirdness. I don't think it's undoable in this case, but when you combine that along with the now request that subdivisions still be allowed as they are under the agricultural district, and similarly on the east side under the rural zoning district on that side. On the west side, the weirdness of that is that while agricultural doesn't allow any subdivisions, it still allows the family exemption, the family subdivisions. So at least in theory, there could be a split out for a home and 3 other splits that I don't quite understand how that works with the commercial resort use. And that's why I want to turn it over to the staff for the details of this. And then the same thing is true on the east side, where we potentially can have subdivisions, albeit at least now we've made headway to know that it's what's allowed under the existing zoning categories. But I still don't think I understand what that means in terms of the proposed uses. So Vlad, would you mind picking it up from there?
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Vlad Finkel with Kootenai County Community Development. I apologize if my speech is slightly slurred. Half of my mouth is numb from seeing a dentist this morning.
You sound good.
I think Director Callahan had done a great job of just introducing some of the concerns that we had. We find that the proposed scope of use that will be on each of the parcels is consistent, if not identical, to what the previously approved conditional use permits allowed. Maybe a slightly more open room for improvements on either of the 2 parcels. But in essence, the applicants have, 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 in essence, modify the conditional zoning development agreement in line with the direction that you have presented or you requested last time. Director Callahan also explained some of the concerns that we as staff had with the possibility of the parcels being further parceled out. And when I say parceled out, that doesn't necessarily mean through a subdivision process. As you know, there are a number of exemptions that somebody may exercise, such as a family exemption. There's a possibility of a court order and other opportunities for the current size of those parcels to be decreased, and having multiple parcels adjacent to whichever parent parcel will remain, or a larger parcel will remain to have the primary use. It begs the question, as Director Callahan had explained, is there could be a possibility where somebody may end up with a vacant parcel and they would like to have the same use. You could have multiple uses on what's currently a 33-acre parcel on the west and a 27-acre parcel on the east. So you could have we find at least 3 RV resorts, and you could have several RV storage facilities, because there's no prohibition on the subdivisions. I think the applicant has made an argument that the current conditional use permits also do not have a prohibition on subdivisions, and that is true. We do not have any stipulations or prohibitions on conditional use permits, but we always advise the applicants, when you have a conditional use permit, it's bound to the conditions of approval set forth in that decision, as well as the parcel size. Hopefully that makes sense. Any change would require an assessment of whether the request is a minor modification or a major modification of that original approval. In this case, we find that this needs to be addressed through the conditional zoning development agreement, so that we are not having to go back and possibly deal with an issue of having multiple property owners through the exemption process to deal with the modification of the conditional zoning development agreement. And so that creates some unknown implications in the future. And so that's kind of our position. Now, when somebody has a conditional use permit, also you could have the possibility of somebody trying to exercise an exemption, but we would advise them as well that they need to modify the CZDA. But if we can spearhead this and be proactive rather than being retroactive in dealing with multiple owners down the road, I think that's the best course of action at this time. Perhaps maybe Director Callahan or Pat Braden can weigh in on some of the potential legal issues or implications of having multiple owners over the same CZDA and having to agree to a modification, and also having multiple uses on the parent parcel or the parent acreage, but having multiple parcels.
Pat, did you want to add, or actually, you have a question, Commissioner Duncan?
Basically, if the property had been subdivided and one owner wanted to change the CZDA, they'd have to get all the owners to agree to that. And then they'd all have to come before the board with their proposed modification. So, I mean, it is possible, but in practice, it's typically very unwieldy.
Just so I understand this correctly, if the property were subdivided, we had multiple different owners, and they wanted to change, what was it, the zoning or the use under?
Conditional zoning development agreement.
Okay, that would require unanimous agreement among the property owners, and then what, coming back before the board in essence?
Yes.
Okay, would there be an advantage to subdividing and putting yourself into that situation that you could see?
I really don't, myself. But I
Okay.
don't own these properties either, so, it'd probably do well to ask the same question of the applicant.
Okay, Commissioner Duncan, you wanted to ask a question?
So you mentioned that this is more of an expansion of what the CUP already offers. So is that still something that's available to us, is just to take what the proposed use of property in the CZDAs, and in the CZDA, and, well, I guess it's plural, and just enhance the CUPs?
Essentially, if the zone changes were approved with the proposed CZDAs, they would supersede the conditional use permits that have already been approved.
I know, it just sounds like it's more complicated to go through the zone change with the CZDA than it is to expand the conditional use permit. Which is what,
I think that's a good point. Again, probably a question for the applicant as much as anybody.
okay. And yeah, I guess that's a little bit problematic. I guess in my mind, I always thought that the parent parcel would keep, I guess you would have to keep the entire thing in the CZDA. Yeah, that's a problem.
One of the other items I'd like to point out is there's the possibility of a boundary line adjustment that may occur on either of the two parcels that could potentially encumber the parcel that it has been boundary line adjusted with, because the CZDA applies to the acreage at hand. So if you modify it, if you increase the acreage of the parent parcel, you're potentially having only a portion of the CZDA applied. If you decrease the portion of the parent parcel, then you potentially have a portion of the adjoining property encumbered by a CZDA. And so our attempt was to say, before any BLA, any adjustment to the parcels occurs through either a formal subdivision process or an exempt division process, which includes a BLA, the department would need to be notified to assess whether the CZDA needs to be modified. And the applicant has chosen to strike that provision from the most current CZDA that's before you today.
Commissioner Eberline, questions?
That makes a good point.
Let me ask you, can the CZDA be tied to the property in such a way that it is removed if the property is attempted to be subdivided? That it reverts back to its original zoning?
There could be a term in the CZDA that says that.
It says it's for this lot size, and that if you want to subdivide, then the original zoning would go back.
Yeah, or you'd have to amend the CZDA, one or the other.
Okay. Is there any other questions or comments from community development or additional information for the board?
Ben Tarbutt in Community Development for the record. I think one of the comments and questions that we had brought up to the applicant is that I think it's the applicant's position that there would intend to not have any replication of uses should a subdivision occur. So whether it's a family division or some other exempt division of land or a subdivision itself, that they would assume or expect, and the intent was that there wouldn't be any replication of uses. So for instance, if there's a commercial resort, that's the intended use on the westerly property, and the commercial resort allows for a number of things like, ancillary restaurants or convenience stores, those kinds of things, RV park. You could have essentially maybe 3 properties there, and you could have, in theory, you could have an RV park on one, and then they maybe even develop all of the actual uses. And if there was no replication process available, then those 2 properties that were created have essentially 0 uses based on what the CZDA is intended to be used. But it doesn't actually say no replication, or at least I couldn't find anything in the CZDA that says no replications. And another thing is that if there isn't a replication clause, which I do believe that there should be, is that you could have, in theory, 3 restaurants out there. So it appears to be lacking in a couple of different things by not having a replication clause, and in addition to the prohibition of subdivisions. So just thought I'd add that as well.
thank you. Any other questions of the board? Okay, we can now go to the applicant and address your issue with respect to what you brought before us. And Ray Kimball?
Yes. Good morning, Commissioners. Ray Kimball for the record. As you know, I'm a licensed civil engineer and land surveyor here in the state of Idaho. So I'm going to go specifically to the question of, with regards to the subdivision and duplication of use. As this has been a little frustrating on our end. We keep putting options and answers back to staff like, hey, here's what we want. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Staff brings up points that they're concerned about. We put solutions out there towards that. And it's really important to remember that, you know, my client doesn't want to unnecessarily lose property rights like a family division, being able to do a boundary line adjustment, those things just because they're doing the CZDA. But it's important that we also move towards a solution that works. One of the things that I suggested in an email to staff was that we could add a caveat to section D, and this is specific, right, this one in particular is specific to the western parcel, that says something to the effect of, the subject property is described in section B, which is the legal description of the entire parcel, is limited to a single commercial resort as defined above. So one resort, no duplication, okay? Any subdivision allowed under this agreement shall designate which property the commercial resort was located. All other parcels shall be limited in use to those allowed under the agricultural zone, which is the zone that it's there today. So basically what does it do? It means that if my client wants to do a family subdivision, carve off 10 acres to give to one of her children, and that's in the back corner or whatever, and it's not part of the commercial resort, she can do that. It's just as simple as that. It's limiting. It takes care of the duplication issue that staff brought up. It ensures that uses are still restricted to, there's no expansion of use, because when staff brought up the subdivision part initially, the big concern was that, well, commercial zoning allows residential uses and no minimum lot size. And the thought was that it's an end around to do 31 acre lots. And it's not, definitely not. But, you know, that would be an option in the code. And we don't want that. We want to make sure that that is not the case, which is why we're presenting it in this way, to keep what is there, to do our best to try to keep what's there today as options, but have that commercial resort. Same thing on the east side. And that's pretty much it. We've pared everything down to commercial resort, caretaker's quarters on the west. The boat storage, concierge service, you know, marine sales and service and whatnot. And then to answer the question about whether this is just an expansion of a CUP and can we do it, is that unfortunately there are, I mean, maybe on the commercial resort side, but that's gets really, really tricky because of some of the commercial aspects. But more particularly on the east side, any commercial use beyond storage is not allowed, even as a conditional use. So it has to be a commercial with a CCDA. We do feel that this is the cleanest route for us to go to restrict everything. It's simple. We've reduced our guardrails down to a very, very narrow scope, as directed by you folks. And We think that this meets the requirements. We certainly believe it meets all the requirements as outlined under the code. And keep in mind where we started was a full zone change request, and it had over 90% community approval. The response rate out of all the community that took the time out of their day to respond was a 90% in favor. And so it's got community support, and we think that this is a potential for a great thing for the local community. And we think we've got it right down there to the point where it's as narrow as possible and has met what we feel that you were telling us. And that's all I got.
Any questions?
I do. So if the east side is not allowed expanding the conditional use permit, and we do a CZDA, I think that's maybe more appropriate. But for the west side, it sounds like if you can do it in an expanded CUP, and that might be more of the area that might be subdivided and have, different issues, then is that something that would work?
Well, I think the conditional use permit process, I think the owner started that 3 years ago, maybe 4. That was a long time ago. It took them a long time to get through that process. The CZDA process, we started that in, I think, December. And if the answer is the same, if it's really the same result either way, we think it's, rather than going through another